Welcome everybody to the Nutrient Trading Breakout Session. My name is Keith Larrick. I'm Natural Resources Director with North Carolina Farm Bureau. This morning we'll be hearing about some information on nutrient trading programs and how those work. A little bit about nutrient-sensitive waters regulations for agriculture in North Carolina, and then sort of how those two may work together. Can they work together? When you look at the fact that North Carolina has its own mandatory requirements for agriculture for these nutrient-sensitive basins. So we'll have three speakers that go into that topic. The time we have left, I'll give a brief presentation on EPA's Waters of the U.S. rulemaking, sort of a timeline, legal process, and hit on a few of the issues that agriculture groups have brought up. And I'll get you out of here on time, either to go to the legislative luncheon or grab something on your own. So the first speaker we have up this morning is Julie Henshaw. I assume most of you know Julie already. She's section chief of the non-point source programs in the division, coordinates the cost share programs and the division's duties related to reporting on these agricultural rules that you hear about. She's going to set the stage a little bit by giving us an overview of the nutrient-sensitive rules and how agriculture fits into that program. So please welcome Julie.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking your time this morning to learn a little bit more about about an important topic. I guess it's kind of near and dear to my heart. I have actually helped develop each one of these basins plans, and I'm really excited that we have a permanent staff in our section, Joey Hester, who actually has taken over that role for reporting. So as Keith said this morning, my job here today is just to kind of give you a quick overview and set the stage on nutrient management regulations in the state, how that affects agriculture, and then I'm going to close with some considerations as you hear more about trading from our next two speakers. Before we begin, though, I wanted to show you the affected area. I'm going to see, is it the center point? This is a geographic area that is covered by nutrient-sensitive waters, some of which have adopted rules and are actually under implementation of strategies. So I'm going to go from left to right. The green basin is the Tarp-Pamlico River Basin. Those rules became effective in 2001. The blue area is the whole Neuse Basin. That was actually our first and a nutrient-sensitive water strategy that was adopted in the 90s. And then we have our Jordan Lake watershed, which is somewhat unique because it's a 3-in-1 strategy. The lake operates in three distinct regions, so there's 3 sets of targets, depending on what part of that basin you live in. And then I forgot to add, the Neuse Basin has a second set of rules that are on top of the upper basin. So that's the Falls Lake, and that has a new strategy that was just effective in 2011. And then last but not least is this High Rock Lake watershed. I wish I had more information for you on that one. It is pending development. We do anticipate, we work closely with the Division of Water Resources, who are the staff that pull together stakeholders and go through a target setting as well as a rule drafting process. And we have gotten information that is going to begin. They are fully staffed and they do have a legislative mandate to begin rule development in that part of the state. So why do we have nutrient management strategies here in North Carolina? We have them because our water quality is impaired. The reservoirs or estuaries are impaired due to exceeding the chlorophyll A standard. And that's how North Carolina measures nutrient concentration. So if we're above the chlorophyll A standard, that water is considered impaired. It is impaired in the Neuse and Tarp-Pamlico estuaries, Jordan Lake, Falls Lake, and High Rock Lake. Some of these other water bodies have additional concerns such as sediment and things of that nature, which agricultural practices can help, or best management practices can help address. But what we're talking about today is targeted to nutrients specifically. Each of these water bodies, with the exception of High Rock Lake, has gone through an intensive stakeholder development rule drafting process, and it's a comprehensive set of rules. So in North Carolina, we do have an agricultural rule where we're trying to achieve the same reduction as the wastewaters and the point source rule. There's also a stormwater rule that regulates stormwater runoff. We have a buffer rule to maintain and protect buffers. So it is a comprehensive strategy. And our goal is to decrease nutrient loading and improve water quality so that our waters are no longer impaired. This is a quick summary of the need to know facts for each basin. And the first is the Neuse River. That rule is effective in 1998. We always target our reduction loadings to a baseline period. So our goal is for this year to have a reduction from our baseline period. So for the Neuse River Basin, that baseline period is the average loading from 1991 to 1995. So each year in our report, we compare this crop year to how we did back then. And our goal is to have a % reduction, and that's a loss reduction. So for the Neuse, it's 30% reduction in nitrogen, and it does not have a phosphorus reduction or target. Pamlico, that rule was effective in 2001. Their baseline period was 10 years previous in 1991. They also have a 30% nitrogen reduction goal from that 1991 time period and a no increase in loading in phosphorus. The Jordan Lake watershed, that rule was effective in 2009. Their average, or their baseline was the average loading from 1997 to 2001. And as you can see, it has the 3 tiers. So the upper New Hope's target is to reduce nitrogen by 35% and phosphorus by 5%. The lower New Hope is to have no increase in loading from the baseline period for either nitrogen or phosphorus. And then the Haw River arm is to have an 8% reduction in nitrogen and a 5% reduction in phosphorus. Falls Lake is, I guess the upper Neuse has to report 2 times. So the Falls Basin, their baseline period is 2006. And they have a 2-tiered goal. So stage 1 means that we have to meet these targets by 2020, or the Environmental Management Commission can dictate what next steps need to happen on agricultural operations. So our goal is to meet a 20% reduction in nitrogen by 2020 and a 40% reduction in phosphorus. And by 2035, that'll be a 40% reduction in nitrogen and a 77% reduction in phosphorus. So those are pretty lofty goals, as you can imagine. I think what sets agriculture rules apart is that we've adopted a collective compliance approach, and what that means is that an individual producer doesn't have to meet that 30% reduction or whatever that target reduction is on his or her own. They work as a group and collectively assess how many acres are under production, what are the fertilizer rates for the crops that are grown in that watershed, what BMPs have been installed to help mitigate that nutrient loss. So they work together to meet their reduction. Our goal is always to reduce the nutrients from that baseline period. And I think another thing that sets us apart are the oversight committees. They were created to develop accounting tools and help with completing required reports on agriculture's progress. So I just wanted to give you a quick snapshot of who the players are who come together and discuss how is agriculture doing, what methodology should we use to account for our progress, and what can we do differently to further our progress. So you can see we have representatives of agricultural agencies. We have folks from Division of Water Resources. We have environmental representatives on these committees, as well as specific farming interests based on the affected area. And then we always have a scientific advisor, so someone from the university system to help ensure that the science we're using is correct. Some watersheds do have an additional level, which is a local advisory committee, and some of you may be involved in those at your district level, where you pull together producers and resource people at the local level to kind of confirm the data that's submitted to those reports. They're not required in all strategies based on the workload and the support staff that we currently have to do this type of work. I wanted to take just 1 minute to let you know how we actually report our reduction progress. The Environmental Management Commission had to approve accounting methods for how agriculture reports. There are 3 tools in our toolbox. The first is the cropland nitrogen loss. We use the nitrogen loss estimation worksheet tool. And that is an empirical spreadsheet-based model, and that was developed by NC State. Deanna is here, so if you have any technical questions, I'll probably ask for her help with that. And the Division of Water Resources and NRCS. It estimates nitrogen loss from cropland agriculture by comparing the baseline loss to what is actually lost this current year. It is a county-based tool. So each year we collect data on the number of acres and types of crops that are grown, the fertilizer rates that are being used by producers in that county for that watershed, and the BMPs that are implemented, and that gives us a % reduction. The second is the phosphorus. For phosphorus loss, we use qualitative indicators. That our methodology was developed by the Phosphorus Technical Committee. This methodology was approved in 2005 and updated with the completion of the Jordan Lake watershed. And so there's 9 indicators that we use to qualitatively assess the risk of phosphorus loss. So meaning were there more an example would be what was the soil test P in the baseline period and compare it to this year. And so it's kind of either it's increasing or decreasing, and we total up each of those 9 parameters and give it an indicator. The indicators assess that it's increasing or decreasing. To date, for our basins, we have been able to have more indicators decreasing, so therefore we feel that we are meeting our goals. And the last tool that we only have to employ in a handful of watersheds is for pasture land nitrogen loss, and that's a point system based on BMPs installed on pasture operations. That's more important in the Piedmont basins that are related to Jordan Lake and across those watersheds. So the takeaway is, how does agriculture meet their reduction targets? The first is fertilizer rate decreases over time. Folks have used different amounts of fertilizer for a variety of different reasons. Cropping shift. If we grow a lot of corn, our nitrogen reduction rate is not as high as when we grow a lot of soybeans. So based on what crops are planted. BMP implementation, agriculture is able to get reduction credits for buffers from 20 to 100 feet in width, water control structures, and nutrient scavenger crops. And then last, we were able to account for reduction based on the number of acres in production. So that would take into consideration any cropland that's converted to grasses or trees through federal or state cost share programs. It would take into consideration any land that's left idle for a year and not reported. It would also take into consideration any land use changes where agricultural land has been converted to development. So when we consider trading, it's important to remember that nutrient-sensitive waters do include provisions for trading among sources. So our existing rule structure does allow for that in some capacity. All state agencies are currently going through a rule readoption process, and the nutrient-sensitive water strategies rules are currently in the readoption phase, and there are changes that are quite likely to the existing rules. So I didn't want to spend a lot of time going over nuts and bolts and what's currently allowed and what may be allowed. I think an important take-home note is that what agriculture reports is a nitrogen loss reduction versus a loading reduction. So it's an edge of stream estimate based on the county level. And for our trading, it's very important to have specific loading reductions per site. And I think the biggest challenge for agriculture is that we'll need to meet and maintain our own reduction percentage with a margin of safety before trading opportunities for other sources can begin. And that's important because the ways that agriculture meets those reductions are very dynamic. So dependent upon commodity prices, the weather, there's a lot of things that change, and it changes up and down. Our percent reduction goes up and down. And so we want to make sure that if trading were to be considered, that we would be ensured that agriculture would be able to meet and maintain their percent reduction. Because otherwise, there could be mandatory BMPs. We don't know what would happen to date. We've been successful in meeting our targets. But I just think that that's something important to consider as we move forward. And with that, I'm happy to take questions or move on to the next presenter.
We have time for a couple questions for Julie. Jeff, go ahead.
Have there been any studies done on where the nutrient loading in these areas are coming from, say agricultural versus urban?
There has been, I guess, some research to that effect about whether it's been on a broad enough scale with enough data source or data collection points to assess that. I think, would be hard to measure. I'm sad that Deanna just left the room. She's really our monitoring expert, and she could probably answer that question better than I can. But I think it's fair to say that, that all sources are contributing. However, they may be at different levels, but our targets are for the same amount. So stormwater has to reduce by 30%. We have to reduce by 30%. New development has to reduce by that same percentage.
Right. Based on the results all that of the solar beads in Jordan Lake, is there any plan to put solar beads on any of these other reservoirs?
Not that I'm aware of, but I certainly don't work in that world. Specifically.
What results?
That's what I'm saying.
So we have been working with our producers to install as many best management practices that we receive credit for. So those are, once again, buffers, water control structures, and nutrient scavenger crops. That's where our emphasis is in.
I think it's safe to say on the agriculture side, the implementation is just moving ahead as specified in the rule, and then whatever folks decide to do out of our control, that's what they'll do.
What's an example of a water control structure?
So that probably doesn't work in your part of the world. That works in the use of the Tar-Pamlico Basin. So it's where you there's different types. There's inline where you can put a water control structure on a tile drain and raise that water level up and release it more slowly. And we also have flashboard riser type structures that hold that water back and allow it to reduce nitrogen.
A lot of mostly used in drainage and first class.
Correct, exactly.
All this work, has that resulted in the chlorophyll haze going down?
I guess the best way to answer that is the latest rounds of data from the Division of Water Resources have not shown a significant decrease in chlorophyll A in the estuaries or lakes. That could be for a variety of reasons. I believe their last data, there was some trend analysis where some components of nutrients were increasing and some were decreasing.
So maybe it's not agricultural fault, but it's that way. Are they looking at other things?
Every land user is regulated and has the same reduction target. So yes, I think that we're all in this together.
I see one more question. Okay. We'll take one more.
Expand other river basins in North Carolina?
I think we'll have to see how High Rock Lake process goes. Because it's a new department leadership. We'll just have to see how that process goes. Right now, they don't have a legislative mandate to move beyond High Rock Lake. It doesn't mean that it wouldn't happen, but I think by the speed that process moves forward, we'll have an indicator of how the rest of the state may fare.
All right. Let's thank Julie. Next up, we have Alex Eccles. Alex is the Executive Vice President for Ecosystem Services Exchange. And Alex is going to give us some information on nutrient trading programs and does work from this perspective. So, Alex.
state is to irritate everybody. And I suspect I'll accomplish that. So, you know, I'm not trying to make you mad, but I'm trying to make you think about stuff differently. And I love the last question, which was, tell me what the performance is. You know, to me, it sort of boils down to the question of, well, how's that working for you? And I am impatient. I want to solve these problems. I don't want to solve them 20 years from now. I want to solve them now. I turned 60 last month. That's sort of scary. You know, I don't know how that old guy looks back in the mirror to me. I don't think we can take a backseat to anybody in demanding high-quality, water-productive land system. And the two are in. The fight of our century is not going to be over oil. It may be over religion for the next 50 years, but the real fight is going to be over water and feed. And we are the essential group in figuring out how to solve that. So if I can figure out how to make this projection work, I'll walk through. And hopefully succeed in irritating folks, but not insulting. So my name's Alec Eccles. I'm based in Alexandria, Virginia. I cross the most severe border in the world several times a week to go into Washington, D.C. We have offices spread around the country, and we just hired a new guy, Forrest Brooks, who I saw. There's Forrest. Forrest is here in North Carolina in Apex. So I need to update my slide and put Apex on our location. And what we think about, we started this company about 7 years ago to try to say, how do we get the incentives right? How do we get better water quality developed faster? Most of what I'm going to talk about is not that little molecule of nitrogen or phosphorus. It's about people. And how do we get people to change what they're doing? My wife reminds me fairly often. One of the political definitions of insanity is to keep doing the same thing and expecting different results. Now, I'm not suggesting anybody here is insane. What I'm suggesting is we've got to have as many innovations and advances in our toolbox as possible. This is not the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. It hadn't snowed there over a year. This is the Capitol building in Wisconsin. So I spent the first half of my career working in that Capitol building in Washington. And I wrote a lot of environmental law. Some of you may curse me. I wrote Swamp Buster. I wrote a lot of the first conservation title of the Farm Bill. I grew up on a family farm. I could count. I was the second son of the third daughter, so I knew I wasn't going to be a farmer. I had to do something else. But I always had an admiration for people who were out working on land, feeding people, and said, you know, we'll recognize we're part of the problem. But we don't want to be treated improperly. We want to figure out how to solve these things effectively. So if you think about across this country, how do we solve environmental problems? You know, one of the things that we commonly do, you see this particularly in laws we passed in the 1970s, thou shalt not pollute. Well, that's easy to pass a law. It's really hard to figure out how to make it work. So, you know, we've passed a lot of prohibitions. You know, let's go back to the Rivers and Harbors Act in the 1880s, et cetera. You know, it makes good sense. Second thing we do is set a set of regulations. We'll say, okay, you know, maybe the objective is thou shalt not pollute. Here's what you can do and here's what you can't do. It's a good set of tools. The things that we can do easily, we have done. The problem that we're trying to talk about today, if it was easy, it'd be done. And we've got to think about how do we advance more effective strategies. I'm not saying we turn our backs on any of these, but we need to think about more policies and strategies to effectively do this and do it cost effectively and time. And we've got to do it in a time period where we've got to feed more people than we've fed in the history of civilization. You know, as I'm sure you all heard about, the next 50 years we're going to have to produce more food than we've produced in the history of agriculture. And that means we've got to innovate the production side. I'm not willing to turn over a world that didn't have the environmental quality that's at least as good as what we have now. I hope it gets a lot better. So in the past 20 years, we've done a lot on advancing tax policy. We've created a lot of government incentives. And our CS, state agencies, et cetera, have lots of programs for that. What we're just starting to think about are markets. My family grows apples. We like apples. What we love is the farm. If I can make money with quail, water, I'll figure out how to grow quail or water. So, if, you know, which would you rather take to the farm? This is made up, there's no office compliance. Which one would you rather take to a farmer and say, I'm here to help? Well, you know, all kidding aside, the problem with regulations is they restrict opportunity. They restrict freedom. They tell people what you can't do and what you can do. I like to be told what to do. I know my kids don't like to be told what to do. I don't even try to tell a lot of people what to do. But we've got to figure out how do we foster more innovation? How do we foster efficiency? When you create an incentive instead of regulation, you create opportunity. You know, I commonly say, if somebody offers me this instead of a regulation, I'm going to figure out how to beat my neighbor to get there, because I'm going to try to deliver. Well, that's what trading and markets have the potential to help us. We need more choices. I'll do a little rant about the MPs here in a few minutes. And again, I'm not trying to make people mad. I'm just trying to irritate. We need innovation. We need to develop new tools. The tools that we've developed and used over the past 20, 30,000 years are pretty good tools. We need more. We need to foster innovation. We need to be less disruptive. We need to get out of this situation where everybody's pointing around and saying, he or she's the problem, it's not me. We need to have the battle become not avoiding the regulation, not avoiding the regulatory compliance costs, not building the infrastructure that's required, the external infrastructure that's required to enforce that. The battle needs to become, how do we get there first and foremost? How do we race to markets and trading are very good at embracing these kinds of practices. Now again, they're not the panacea, they're not the sole solution, but they're an important tool that has been vastly underutilized. I've worked in the environmental field my whole life. This is the question that I hear 95% of the time from the environment community. We need more money. Guess what? There's not going to be more money. Well, back, seemed like a lifetime ago, I worked with the Senate Budget Committee. Back then, it was remember Graham, a few of you were old enough to remember Graham. We announced the glide path to the balanced budget. I don't know what happened to that. But I know that glide paths don't go up, they go down. The amount of money that's going to be available, it's not going to be a big jump. We'll be lucky to hold on. What I think instead what we need is, we need to get more for our money. We need to say, okay, here's $1,000. Let's see what you can produce. That's how we produce lots of other things in this country. But we haven't figured out how to do that for the environment. We need to foster innovation. We need to understand which practices produce what kind of performance on what items. So here's my little rant about BEPs. And, you know, it's a commonly used term. I'm a Southerner. We understand Pyrrhic victories that, you know, sometimes you'll make a point you expect to lose. I no longer use the phrase BEP. The B stands for bullshit. And the reason is, what does B say best? I was a scientist once, you know, now I've lived in that funny town up on the river long enough that I'll claim to be a hacker instead of a scientist. Best would suggest that we know which one is best. I don't think we do. We know some are better. We may know some that outperform. But there isn't going to be a single solution to this. We need to further advance our understanding of performance of which practices on which farms at which time are going to produce results. Now, you know, what is the single greatest variable that affects nutrient loss off of ag lands? Precipitation. I don't know very many farmers who control that. I know a few that have irrigation, and they might control some of that. But if we can't figure out how to get better performance, we're going to lose, and it's not going to be acceptable. regulatory approach typically is going to lock in technology. It's going to be backward-looking instead of forward-looking. And again, that's not to say that's not a good part of the solution, but we need better performance and innovation. We need to be flexible so that we can select efficient practices, reward those practices. Frankly, I'd love to see a farmer making money for producing high-quality water. We haven't sort of crossed the threshold in this country of water as a crop, but there's certainly a lot of people working on that. So I'm going to give a handful of examples of where markets have worked spectacularly. Back in the 80s, we were worried about acid rain as the #1 environmental issue. You know, back then people were talking about global cooling. We controlled the particulate emissions problems in this country by and large. And the big problem was acid rain. And there was a lot of speculation that in New England and the Midwest, we were going to lose our native fisheries. And we were going to lose them because of sulfur dioxide, largely, and nitrogen dioxide losses coming out of power plants in the Midwest. And we passed a major revision to the Clean Air Act to take that on. It was highly innovative, and it set up a trading program to allow different point sources to trade with each other on compliance. And if, say, I can reduce the emissions from my power plant at half the cost of you reducing it from your power plant,
I'm good.
you could buy those credits now. And it would give you more time to make those reductions. This practice of using markets stunned everybody in how effective it was and how it drove down the cost of compliance. The regulatory program implemented in trading systems. It was between 10 and 20% of the best estimates, meaning the highest performing estimates, of the cost of reducing acid rain in the country. Worked spectacularly well. This market worked. This is not the same kind of market that we might be talking about for specific watersheds. This is a national market. The airshed has a very different scale than a watershed. But it works spectacularly well. 10% of the estimated cost to reduce this. And, you know, I don't hear people talking about acid rain anymore. I know other folks here folks talk about this. There are a few incidents, very isolated. But we've solved that problem. And we solved it at a fraction of the cost that we would have because we built this system that allowed trading. There are other programs that are important for trading. So I'm just going to talk about one here. Wetlands trading. I like wetlands. Wetlands for me are a contact sport. I like going out, rolling around on them, looking at the birds and then looking at the critters. And I kind of like doing it with a piece of iron in my hand during duck season too. But I like doing it year round. And we were losing wetlands at an incredible rate this country. You know, we changed the regulatory issues. We enacted swamp laws. We took away the federal subsidies for conversion of wetlands for development. But one of the huge things that we did was it took 20 years for the Corps of Engineers to finally promulgate a rule that says we will allow wetlands mitigation trading. Today it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And people are uncomfortable with that kind of innovation. Back when those rules were first passed, the question was, well, are we getting value? Are we getting the same type of wetlands? We're losing a wetland function over here with the highway going in. Are we getting that back here? I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's working pretty well today. We don't have people saying we're not getting wetland protection. We're actually adding to the wetlands. The environmental function, the ecosystem services that we're producing today are better because of this system, and the cost is better because of it. It's reduced the cost of the compliance activities. It's added to U.S. wetlands. So I'm going to shift very quickly into talking about water quality trading across the U.S. There are about a dozen states that have water quality trading. I would say that maybe we're operating the Stanley steamers of trading today. I hope that the next 10 years we'll be operating Teslas of trading today. We've made a bunch of mistakes. We're not getting it perfect yet. We haven't figured out how to quantify these things yet. But the markets are pretty efficient. The markets are pretty good about recognizing, are you getting what you asked for, what you bought? And the buyer doesn't have much patience if they bought something and they're not getting that performance. So these water quality trading systems have ranged in a variety of different kind of commodities that are traded. In the Pacific Northwest, it's largely temperature that's being traded. So there's a very heavy incidence of nuclear plants out in the Pacific Northwest. Not adding to acid rain, not adding to global warming, but they're putting a lot of hot water back into these streams because they're using trout streams largely to cool nuclear plants. Well, that's not too good for the trout. So they were going to be forced to build chillers. Oh man, I've taken enough physics to understand the thermodynamics of trying to cool down that water coming out of a nuclear plant and how much energy that's going to burn. Well, somebody had the bright idea saying, let's just revegetate the riparian systems and see what that does to the water quality, what it does to the temperature. It drove it down. It drove the temperature down back to the original baseline. The trout are happy, the salmon are happy. They did it at about 15% of the cost of building the chillers, of the capital cost. The operator cost was a fraction of that. In Maryland, we have one of the oldest trading programs on the book. It's about 15 years old. Do you know how many water quality trades occur in Maryland today? The reason is the rules that were written for that program were so rigorous that nobody would sign up for it. Basically, it required that you publish on the web your nutrient management plan for your farm, your cropping history for the farm, your yield history for the farm. And I don't know too many farmers that want to put that kind of stuff up on there for not only their neighbors and their competitors to know, but the folks in the urban areas that are looking to sue them. So, we've got a variety of different kind of trading programs. My home state, the Commonwealth of Virginia, we've got a trading program that is reliant almost exclusively on land retirement. There's a role for land retirement, but I don't know how we're going to feed those extra billions of people that are demanding not just more calories, but higher quality calories. They don't want to be eating 1,000 calories of rice. They want to be eating 1,500 calories of pork and chicken, and protein. And that's largely going to get produced in our country. So land retirement's a great tool. Shouldn't be overlooked. We've got to fix that set of the trading rules in the Commonwealth. I'm going to talk just about one practice here for a minute. As I said, there are going to be many, many tools necessary for this work. Cover crops are going to be important. Retiring land is going to be important. One of the great overlooked strategies for reducing nutrient loss is to think about how water moves off the land. That little molecule of nitrogen will bind with that molecule of water if it's not tied up somewhere else. The nitrogen by and large is water soluble. And increasingly we're discovering a lot of phosphorus as well. A lot of the phosphorus is not necessarily bound with the soil, but moves easily when water moves. So if you look about our part of the country, there's a lot of drainage here in eastern North Carolina. Not so much when you get over into the western part. But the Midwest, those parts in the western part of the state are probably under some pressure about what's going on in the Gulf of Mexico. When you look upstream of the Gulf of Mexico, there in the Mississippi Basin, many of those areas have over 80% drainage. Well, drainage is great for improving ag productivity. Typically, it might improve productivity by 30% per year. But it's like building a superhighway to move nutrients out of the field and into our waterways. That's not where we want those systems. So, I don't want to just to talk about this one practice, but just a few flyby observations about drainage. There's some advantages to a variety of these kinds of practices. That if we actually hold back some of those water systems, if we run them through saturated buffers, through markets, through constructed wetlands, we can reduce the nutrient loads coming off of those lands very cost-effectively. Those practices are highly reliable. They're easily quantified. They can easily be third-party certified. Remember, that buyer wants to know, if I just spent $10,000 on buying some nutrients, I'll make sure I've got $10,000 worth of nutrient credit cards. So we need to have this third-party certification. It's a capital investment that's going to operate for years. It's not an annual investment. We have to do every year. You know, I love cover crops. Great thing. Well, how do you quantify the performance of a cover crop? Did you get that cover crop planted in September? Or were you slow getting that crop off of it? Maybe it got planted in December. Did you get germination? What was that cover crop? Was it oats? Was it rye? Was it radishes? What's the performance of those different kinds of practices? Again, important practices, but quantifying the return on investment is very difficult. For these sets of practices, quantifying the return is much, much simpler. So one of the things that's attractive to this is the return on investment. Typically, this is one of the highest return on investments in the lands where it's suitable. It's not suitable for all lands. It's suitable for some lands. But you're going to get one of the highest reductions in nutrient load coming off. Doesn't mean it's the only practice you install. It's going to take a suite of practices. So, we have lots of markets operating today. We're probably going to have more ecosystem service operating in the next 20 years. The ones that are operating today, water quality, flood reduction, you know, if you hold water on an ag field, instead of having it in an urbanized area, I don't like to have my field flooded, but if somebody pays me to flood it to keep water out of their first floor of their house, okay, you know, that's a new crop farm, that's a new market. A lot of people will pay a whole lot of money to keep water out of their house. Not very many people will pay very much money for water quality today. But this flood reduction market's going to move along very quickly. We've already got wetland stream mitigation. We're starting to see habitat for threatened and endangered species move along pretty quickly. So I expect these markets to develop. For them to develop, we've got to be comfortable that we can commoditize what's produced. So we've got to be comfortable, be willing to pay somebody to produce it. You know, by and large in this country, we expect environmental quality to be free. Okay, you know, I like that. But it's going to cost somebody money to implement. Are we going to be able to cost share all of that? Cost share, that's a tough word, share. With share means you get some of your money back, maybe not your labor back. Most farmers, I think, want to be responsible. There are always a few bad actors, but most really want to do it. They view their stewardship obligation as very serious. But again, if they can make money by doing this, all those restrictions about innovation all away. You know, then the restrictions are the innovation here. Can I figure out how to make money doing this? What's the practice that's going to work on my farm? So this is my last slide. Sorry, I probably droned on longer than anybody wants to. I haven't seen anybody thrown off mad yet, so maybe I haven't irritated you enough. If we get it right, as you're thinking about updating your nutrient trading program, think about how do we add tools. Here are some of the things that are really critical to add to the tools. How are we going to get more for each dollar investment? Okay, the perfect's the end of the good. Are we going to get a little more for most dollars invested? That's probably the right benchmark. You know, the perfect science is the enemy of the good. We've got to get good enough science. We can't go out and measure what's coming off of every field, even if we wanted to, and I suspect we don't want to. It would eat you alive to quantify all of that. But we're getting better and better about understanding the performance of different kind of practices. So, you know, as taxpayers, it's important. For farmers, it's important. Farmers can say, I have another crop, another asset portfolio that I'm bringing into my mix. The innovators are going to figure it out. Or, you hear a lot about the question of environmental justice in the environmental field today. Typically that means do underserved communities end up carrying a disproportionate share of the costs? Well, I think there's a valid point to that. Well, part of it is because of the structure. We haven't set up a system that's going to reward people for the performance. Typically, if you look at, say, a wastewater treatment plant, there's a massive capital requirement for investment in upgrading wastewater treatment plants. We're going to face about $2 trillion in new costs for wastewater treatment plants in this country in the next 15 years. Nobody knows where the money's coming from. We can probably offset those kinds of reductions at maybe 10 to 30% of the cost by working with agriculture. We do not have the framework to set that up. And if we're going to meet those kinds of water quality requirements that I think most folks want, we've got to have that kind of strategy. Most importantly, I think, is we need innovation. We need to figure out 21st century solutions to 21st century problems. Easy problems we solve. The point source community, by and large, has addressed the requirements that were first imposed on them in the 1970s. Radically different. We have 1,000 years of experience in pouring concrete through wastewater systems. We're pretty good at figuring out the cost and the performance, plus or minus 50%. We haven't gotten there in the ag systems yet. That's what we've got to do. We've got to have innovative systems. Thank you all for your patience. I'm happy to take any questions.
I think we've got time for a question or two before we move on. So if anybody...
How did, you're talking about cooling the water from nuclear power plants, and how did they do that exactly?
The question is, how do they cool the water coming from nuclear power plants? There was a group called the Willamette Partnership, that's the name of the river. And what they figured out was most of the rivers downstream of that power plant were heavily used for grazing. And the riparian areas were not heavily vegetated. And what they did was they went in and they planted trees, fenced off the riparian areas, planted trees along the riparian banks, and monitored the water temperature. And they did it over about a 15-mile stretch. They've done it now in 4 or 5 different places. It brought the water temperature back down below where it was before the power plant was built. And so it was shade. Shade works pretty well. Yes.
In North Carolina, because as Julie mentioned, we have established regulatory programs where agriculture has to meet goals. That's what makes trading difficult, because agriculture has to meet and maintain its goals. But what we're seeing is people who have taxing authority, like local governments, want to come in and buy those credits, so they're no longer available for agriculture to meet their compliance goals. And we see that as a huge problem with the whole trading issue. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. So the question is, who consumes the trading credits? That in North Carolina, you have a set of rules that deal with targets for different sectors. And there are folks that come from the non-ag sector that are interested in purchasing credits from the ag sector, but the ag sector is having challenges meeting its targets. I'm not an expert on the North Carolina system, so grain of salt for this. If a producer can figure out how to exceed their targets and how to do it to an economic advantage, you're going to promote broader implementation. I agree, there's got to be a baseline. Before somebody sells the credit, you've got to see a net lift in the environmental qualities produced. And how do you set that baseline? That's a local decision about how you set that baseline. Our own company, what we do is say everybody's got to be, and frankly, there are not a lot of water quality trades operating across the country today. But we say people have to be in compliance with all their state and federal regulatory programs. And we retire 1 credit for every credit that we enter into the market so that there is a net lift. So as you're looking at the redesign of the North Carolina Trading Protocol, I think it's important to ask that question. Are we getting the kind of lift out of the ag sector that we want? What are the impediments? If we're creating opportunity instead of restricting opportunity, there's going to be more lift. And, personally, I'm really happy to have utilities, et cetera, coming in and investing in agriculture. It's a new source of capital to come in. When you look at the amount of funding available for conservation across this country, I kid you not, we peaked about 7 years ago, the declining basis. We've got to figure out how do we get more capital into conservation to make that kind of investment. If we don't, guess what? We're going to lose. So, right now as you're developing the new protocols for the trading system, I think that's the essential question to ask. You've got to say, are we getting performance? How do we assess what that performance is? We're not going to go out and measure on every part. But we need to figure out what the performance range is for different kinds of practices. You probably got to have a model, and you got to keep it simple enough so that it's affordable to do. Say, what's the precipitation rate? What are the ambient environmental conditions? But how do we get that producer to install more management practices, not resist implementation of management practices on? And what we've seen from markets that are operating in different sectors is when you get the incentives right, boy, there's an explosion in performance. I think that's the key question. And I'd be happy to help on that any way I can. But that's one of the things you're wrestling with right now.
Okay, I know we got a couple more questions, but I want to make sure we have time for our next speaker, and then we'll revisit some Q&A after that.
Thank you.
Our last speaker is Dr. Deanna Osmond. She is the extension leader in the Soil Science Department at NCASWCD University. A lot of experience dealing with agriculture non-point source issues. And she will be talking about a few of the issues, maybe from the perspective of her work related to the ag community. So, Dr. Osmond.
I want to thank Alex and Julie for setting me up for this talk. I think some of the themes that I have are going to feed into some of the things they were talking about. I've been working on a very large project with an multidisciplinary team, one of whom is Dana Hoke. He is an applied economist, agricultural economist from Colorado State. He also worked in this state a long time ago, and his graduate student, Marzi. So most of the work that I'm going to show you was done by Dana and Marzi, but it's very important relative to this notion of trading. So we're going to go specifically to the Jordan Lake watershed to give you an example of some of the things that we need to be thinking about if trading is going to work or not work. So how does this thingy work? I'm pushing, oh, it's this button. Yeah, thank you very much. So this is a picture of Jordan Lake watershed land use. Notice the pink areas, those are the urban areas that are rapidly expanding. The green color is all the forested area in this watershed, and the yellow is the agriculture, that is pastures and hayland. Brown color is cropland. You all see any cropland? No. But we know from an on-the-ground survey of about 900 producers that about 30% of the land in Jordan Lake is cropland. Okay, so it's important to understand your land uses because this is low-intensity agriculture. Most of the hay and pasture land is under-fertilized with nitrogen and phosphorus. All right, so with that, Julie already noted that all of the sources of nutrients have to be part of the solution. Non-point source ag and urban and point sources. In addition, in the Jordan Lake watershed, as she's already shown you, there are particular reductions of nitrogen and phosphorus associated with each subbasin. But the one thing that was different in Jordan than from the original Noose and TARPAM rules was this notion of trading. They explicitly put a trading regulatory structure in place. Now, the trades can be point to point, they can be point to non-point, they can also be non-point ag and non-point urban. And that was the primary reason that trading was put into the regulatory framework. They wanted urban developers to be able to trade nutrient credits with ag. So the way it's structured now is that developers have to meet a particular standard to reduce their nutrients, but not all of their nutrients have to be removed through stormwater practices. They can buy a portion of their credit. That's really important to recognize. So the thought was that it will reduce the cost for the developers and it will increase conservation in the basin. So everybody was thinking that trading would be this great win-win. One of the things that I do is very applied research. And based on the regulatory framework that was set in the Jordan Lake watershed, I had an opportunity to work with this multidisciplinary team to answer some really important questions on what is the effectiveness of exclusion fencing, what is the effectiveness of trading in this basin. So a group of us, did this multidisciplinary project, which has a very, very long name, and the work that I'm going to show you comes out of that project. So right now I've put on Dana's hat. I'm no economist, you all know that I'm an agronomist, soil scientist, but he's pretty good at making this stuff simple enough that even I can understand it. So the bottom line is for trading to work, you have to have a physical environment, you have to have something to buy, and you have to have something to sell. So Alex just talked about this great situation in Washington where they were looking at temperature. They had something to buy, they had something to trade, and it was quantifiable. Right, really important, quantifiable. So when we're talking in the realm of non-point source urban, trading with non-point source ag, you need to have urbanization going on at a fairly rapid rate, which is happening in Jordan Lake. And you need to have intensive agriculture. Now, what was one of the first things that I said when I showed you the Jordan Lake watershed slide? It's not intensive agriculture, right? You all know that. A bunch of cows running around for the most part. Okay. So for markets to work efficiently, and Alex talked about some of these markets that work really well, like point-to-point trading for acid rain to reduce the sulfur content. You have to have a supply. Supply. You have a demand. If the demand is too great and supply is too low, then it doesn't work, and vice versa. But where these two match, you have a price and you have a quantity for your credits. And this is considered a really efficient market. And so some of the things that Alex was talking about were efficient markets, which drove down the cost. However, sometimes when you're talking about the economic environment, you have a huge supply of something and perhaps no demand, or vice versa. The lines never cross, it's not efficient to trade. Right, so this is really important. So let me show you what we did. So we always work with modelers. Modelers are our friends. We also know that there are problems with models, but they understand these problems, and they developed SWAT, which is probably the premier hydrologic model used for agricultural watersheds. The cool thing about Jordan Lake is they have this huge amount of water quality data, which allowed us to calibrate and validate the model for a 15-year time period. And so once the model was calibrated, they were able to look at stream flow, total phosphorus and nitrogen and nitrate loads. So the modelers were fairly confident that the SWOT model was working well. And so they were able to ask some questions and look at some things, and I want to talk about that. But then they passed their data on to the economist. So the next slide I'm going to show you is that SWOT was able to pick up all the different fields, and most of the fields were 10 acres or less. This corresponds with the on-the-ground survey we did a number of years ago, where we found out the average field size in this basin is 12.5 acres, so that matched very well with us. And with all of these fields, agricultural fields, going through SWOT, let me get this thing to work, or maybe not, they came up with this. Now, this is a really important slide because it talks about verification of nutrient loading. During the baseline period, and Julie talked about baseline periods being set, and everything is calibrated against that baseline period. You have to get your reductions against that baseline period. They looked at the total nitrogen for that baseline period and the total phosphorus. And remember, this was validated against real data, so this just isn't made up data. This is very sound. And they looked at the average kilos per hectare and kilos of total nitrogen and total phosphorus. You can think basically pounds per acre, it's basically the same thing. But I really want to focus on this. They ran their model and they said, we're going to pretend there are no buffers next to fields that abut streams. And in the current climate, they found that there was more nitrogen loaded and more phosphorus loaded than the baseline period. This is really important. Alex talked about this. This is precipitation driven. These were very dry years. These were much, much wetter years. And so without any conservation practices, you have a lot more nitrogen and phosphorus. What they then did was they put buffers on every single field abutting a stream. They couldn't get down to the nitrogen that was delivered in this baseline period because of climate. And so if you're going to have a trading program, you have got to make sure that when you're comparing your water quality changes, that you're comparing apples and oranges. In addition, nitrogen in the coastal plain of North Carolina can take 50 years to travel through the groundwater into the stream. So we have a huge lag time. This is a really important slide, again, because it talks about this baseline period. All right, so they took their data, they passed it off to the economist. And this is where the economist gets in. And for the first field that had the highest ability to reduce nitrogen, they found that it cost 432 pounds per, $432 per pound of total nitrogen reduced. And it's pretty cost effective, yep, and then all of a sudden it becomes prohibitively expensive. So this is a typical supply curve. So what they did was they went in and they said, okay, whoops, wrong button. If we price this at $100,000, how many total pounds of nitrogen can we reduce by putting riparian buffers on agricultural lands? And they found that they could reduce about 6,000 pounds of total nitrogen for about $100,000. After that, the cost gets really prohibitive. Okay, now this is where they did something that's fairly unique. They couldn't find any other examples in the literature because typically people are talking about point source trades with point source or point source with non-point, not so much non-point with non-point. They went to Bill Hunt's group. And first of all, they had to get their hands around what the rules said. And I've already talked about this, but basically it says that a developer has to put stormwater BMPs on their land and get a certain amount of reduction, but not total reduction that's required of them under the regulatory framework. And after that, they can buy credits. Or they can simply oversize their technology and get all of their reduction using stormwater practices. Okay, this is really important. The developers can do it, or they can trade. So they worked with Bill Hunt's group. They looked at the cost of making the stormwater practices bigger. That's all this means, is oversizing urban technology. And they found that they can, as the cost, as the number of pounds of total nitrogen increase, the cost does too. But really around this, at a certain amount, this levels off, and putting in more stormwater conservation practice doesn't really affect the marginal cost too much more. So they took this demand curve and they added it to the supply curve. And where the demand curve crosses the supply curve is where you have this efficient market that we've talked about already. So you can reduce total nitrogen by about 2,500 pounds for about 5,000. This is very effective for the urban developers. But when it starts getting higher for the urban developers, they can just go build their stormwater practices. It's cheaper for them to do it. So this is exactly the kind of market that Damon talked about, which is an efficient market. You've got a supply and a demand, and this is the nick point. That's an efficient market. But what happens is if the developers go in and they buy that 2,500 pounds of total nitrogen, you don't have the same amount of total nitrogen left. You've just removed 2,500 pounds of that total nitrogen from the potential 6,000 that's cost effective. And what happens is you shift your curve for the second year when you're trying to sell credits, and you get this very inefficient market. You've basically used up all your credits. And based on his analysis, the urban stormwater group, the developers, would use out all the total nitrogen credits from ag within 1 to 3 years, and the market would collapse. All right, so very particular situation. So what I've talked to you about is just supply and demand. It hasn't talked about the externalities of the costs of setting the standards and the rules, the trading ratios. This is the uncertainty that Alex talked about that you've got to factor in if you're going to do trading. And then it also costs to set up these markets. So the markets have to be very inefficient to pay for the cost of setting up these markets. So the other thing that people forget is that farmers have to want to sell their lands. So the way the trading program is set up, let's just make sure we all understand this. When the farmer sells his riparian rights and the mitigation bank goes in and buys those rights and plants trees, plants a buffer, that is for in perpetuity. The farmer still owns the land, the farmer still having to pay taxes on the land, but the farmer can't do anything with that land that's in buffers, okay? So that's really important. So we talked to 90 farmers in this watershed, which is really quite a large number. We had this open-ended survey that we did, and we wanted to know what kind of conservation practices they were doing, what kind of nutrient management, what they thought of water quality, and their willingness to trade. And again, I think this is a fairly unique piece of work that hasn't been done before. What they found was that, and those of you that work in this basin know this, 93% of the farmers that have cropland are already using conservation tillage. And many of these folks have been doing it for 40 years. So conservation tillage isn't like a tool you're going to use because the gentlemen and ladies that aren't using are either vegetable farmers or the tobacco farms. Over 50% of all the streams that could be excluded through exclusion fencing were already fenced out. So there aren't a lot of conservation practices to use in this low-intensity agricultural setting. Most importantly, though, they made sure the farmers understood what trading would involve, and they asked them what they thought about it, and the farmers uniformly were negative. It was like, why don't the developers just take care of their own pollution? Part of the thing, too, is that most of the farmers we were talking with were older. They remember when the Haw River used to run green, red, purple, blue, depending on whatever the mills were dying that day. And so for them, their perception was the pollution was still coming from Greensboro, not agriculture. We also talked to some mitigation bankers, and what we found is the reality was that they couldn't find any farmers in either Jordan Lake or Falls Lake to trade with them. They kept trying the same few farmers over and over, and they were getting no traction. So the bottom line is, from this particular study, is that trading has potential. It is clear, based on what Alex talked about today, that there are certain situations, certain practices that will work, but they have to be balanced. It has to make sense physically, economically, and from a policy standpoint. And Dana is in the process of, with some other economists across the country, working on a paper for science, talking about water quality trading, and talking about how important it is to have the appropriate environment and the economics. Jordan Lake, however, is not one of them, nor is Falls Lake. So we have talked to our policy folks at Division of Environmental Quality, and hopefully as they revise the trading rule, they will take into account the work we've done. So one last thing. There are trading rules that have been promulgated versus the fiscal reality, and if people do not look at that, these trades will never work. I mean, it's like what Alex talked about in Maryland. It didn't work because the trading rules and the fiscal reality didn't match. And the market rules versus the farmer's interest may not be lockstep either. So it's just a cautionary tale that trading will not work everywhere. And so we got, I just need to acknowledge the National Institute of Food and Agriculture that funded this, and all the fantastic folks, as well as soil and water conservation personnel that helped with this, and the extension folks and the farmers. And with that, I don't have comments for questions.
If we have a couple questions for Dr. Osmond, and then we'll sort of open it up for questions of the panel in general. So do we have any questions specifically for Dr. Osmond?
Yes.
I guess I'm just wondering, for a trading thing to work, we have to first have this beginning supply and demand, because I'm thinking there's no part in this to create the incentive for the producers to think of new ways for conservation. So you have to have this to start with, and then the innovations come in?
Well, yeah, you can have the innovations come in if you have it, if you're in a watershed where it makes sense. And so, for instance, this doesn't make sense, non-point source to non-point source. It just doesn't, because of the agricultural intensity. I agree with Alex that you have to be, the other thing about these markets that are really tricky is that you have to be sure that your conservation practice works. So for instance, one of the examples he gave was water control structures. Well, we've done enough work in this state, and we've done enough surveys to know that, I mean, the original research was done in this state. We know water control structures work if what? They're managed. And the survey that we did found that, unfortunately, quite a large percent of them weren't being managed. So if you're going to use that as a technology in trading, you better be sure it's being used. And the only way you're going to be sure that it's being used is you have to have a very rigorous checking. Because if you don't, then you're making assumptions that you're getting nutrient reductions that you're not. And that's really dangerous, particularly when we look at the water quality data coming out of these basins. Who asked the question about the news water quality? Are they still in the room? They left. Well, it's gotten worse. The total nitrogen load is much larger, but it's primarily because of the rainfall. You know, you've got to put rainfall in there, and there's some other things going on too. But this is very tricky business. It's one thing to go point to point where you can measure point to point, okay? And they've done that very successfully in the news with point to point trades. But you start getting into the realm of non-point, particularly in ag, and it gets squishy.
All right, do we have any questions for the panel in general? I know.
Oh, in general.
This may not apply to water quality.
Carbon trading credits, positive effect on agriculture.
So the question is, would carbon trading have a positive effect on agriculture? Carbon is trading. It's not a homogenized market across the country or around the world today. Today, it's a pre-compliance market that's operating, meaning nobody gets credits that mean they're complying with their discharge permit associated, so it's voluntary. There are a couple of exceptions to that. California has a regulatory program. Carbon's trading between $12 and $20 a pound in California. It's a lot of money. Carbon in other parts of the country is typically trading at a couple dollars a pound. For a couple dollars a pound, you're not going to motivate a whole lot of people to install a whole lot of practices. But carbon really is a world commodity. It doesn't matter where that carbon comes from. And we're probably going to see more restrictions placed on carbon. We're probably going to see it move from a state or a regional program to a national or international program. And that price is going to come up. That price is going to not just affect greenhouse gases, and I'm not a the sky is falling. I believe the climate is changing. We're seeing 30% more water coming down the Mississippi today than we saw 50 years ago. We're seeing more water come through the Archipelago today than we did 20 years ago. Anybody who's in the farming business will tell you that the weather today is different than it might have been before. A lot of us went fishing on Christmas. I don't think I remember doing that when I was a kid. What we're going to see with these carbon markets is we're going to see, I hope, some stacking of multiple environmental credits. And we can make $20 a ton off the carbon and $30 a pound off the nitrogen. All of a sudden, it becomes valuable. Particularly when we start thinking about nitrogen as a greenhouse gas. N2O is one of the most powerful forms of greenhouse gases that there are. It's about 300 times more powerful than CO2. And if we can capture that N2O credit by processing nitrogen from nitrates in the water in, not N2O, there's a lot of money. Science isn't very good on that yet. Right now, it looks at edge of field measurement. That conversion from nitrate to N2O doesn't happen at edge of field. Typically, it happens when it hits the marine system. And then most of that, those nitrates, that may be wrong, a very large percentage of those nitrates convert to N2O. Well, if you keep those nitrates out of the water upstream, maybe you ought to get credit for it, and you shouldn't just be measuring it at edge of field. So, I agree with Dr. Osborne about why these systems work. This particular watershed that you talked about, frankly, there wasn't much supply. It was not an intensive agricultural area. We've got to have reliance that the performance that we invest in actually occurs. And I've got some material here for anybody who may want it. On those water control structures, they can be automated. They can be run from a cell phone. Frankly, I could be on my boat in the Gulf of Mexico and open and close my weir in North Carolina. It's not going to cost me anymore to do it. It costs me less than taking my pickup truck, driving out to the farm, wading through the area and opening and closing that weir. And if I'm selling my environmental credits, I can give a third party a link to that system so they can verify that I opened and closed my weir. Those are the kind of innovations we need to build into these markets when they work. The old boards that we've installed for the past 30, 50 years, great systems, how do you verify that I actually operate? And, we can work that out, but it's probably cheaper to automate it. Back when most of those systems were designed, we didn't have cell phones. Cell phones are getting pretty cheap. Heck, you could put just a repeater for a Wi-Fi on it and little solar collectors. Solar collectors are cheap nowadays. And you could send a signal that that board was open or closed. We can also design systems like saturated buffers. Not all saturated buffers are going to operate equally. But if there's a routine, the water run through a saturated buffer, you may not need to open those systems or close those systems. So we are in the information age. We've had a revolution in agriculture in this country in the past 20 years. It's not been the kind of green revolution we saw a generation ago. It's been a technology revolution. Farmers are putting the inputs where they think they're going to get a return on investment. That's what we've got to do if we're going to get environmental stuff. We've got to figure out how to put the inputs where we're going to get the return on investment. Sorry,
Well,
taking up too much time.
That's a good conversation, so I hate to cut it off, but I do want to touch briefly on the waters of the U.S. issue. I know a lot of you have heard presentations from various folks on the issues, so I'm actually going to skip past that in the interest of time and just kind of get to the timeline and where things stand in the courts and in Congress. The final rule was published June 29th. A bunch of lawsuits, a lot of states, including the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, a lot of ag groups, a lot of business groups, development groups, things like that, filed suit against the rule because they thought it was too stringent, that it went too far. Several environmental groups filed saying it should have gone further. So all those lawsuits were filed. In late August, there was a stay issued by a district court in North Dakota. That only applied to the states that filed in that court, so 13 states. That did not include North Carolina. The rule became effective August 28th. Everywhere else, including North Carolina, on October 9th, the 6th District Court, which is out of Cincinnati, that was an appeals court, so it's above the district court level. It issued a stay that applied nationwide. That stay is still in place. So currently, EPA is enforcing the old rule. That stay will presumably remain in effect while the court decides jurisdiction. So there's a lot of question over, and these things happen in cases like this, where should the case be tried? Lawsuits are filed, like I say, in 31 states all over the country. Eventually, that'll get consolidated into a couple courts. Currently, this appeals court is deciding if it even has jurisdiction over the issue or not. If they decide that they do have jurisdiction, the stay will remain in place probably while that court litigates the case. If the court decides they don't have jurisdiction, well then the stay they issued wouldn't apply either. That stay would go away. We'd probably be back to the situation where the rule applies in the 37 states, but not in the 13 that were in that North Dakota decision. So it probably would apply in North Carolina at that point. Like I said, a lot of issues related to that. You know, there's cases in many different courts. Bottom line is that one way or another, this will find its way to the Supreme Court eventually. Depending on who hears the case first, you know, we've heard that can be anywhere from 3 to 5 years before the Supreme Court would rule on that, and then the question would be, will the rule be in effect during that time or not? Like I say, right now, there's a stay on it. So we'll update you on that as we find out more. There was some question as to whether Congress would take action to make EPA withdraw the rule or not. Bottom line is that did not happen this legislative session in Congress, and it's likely not going to happen. So bottom line is that this will likely be decided in the courts. Like I also said, EPA is currently enforcing the old rule while that goes on. If something changes, we'll update you on that. In the future, like I say, I wanted folks to get everything they could out of the other discussion, since a lot of you have heard about waters of the U.S. before. I'll take any questions if folks have them based on that 2-minute rundown. Yeah.
I realize a lot of comments were made, how many were opposed to this rule? Have they ever released that?
They did. There were a lot of comments. I think it was in the neighborhood of 1 million comments that EPA received. I think there were probably more comments in favor of it than opposed to it. A comment can be anything from, at Farm Bureau, we submitted, pages and pages of comments, things that we thought should be changed. So that's one comment. A comment can also be one person sending an email and saying, I support you. So, and you get comments like that from both sides. Those are easy to send in. So basically, more people send in emails and tweets saying that they were in favor of it than opposed to it. I think it was in the neighborhood of 60-40 in favor of it, but I could be off on that. There's no other questions. I will let you guys get off to lunch. Thank you very much for coming to this session.